Some years ago, I worked a night shift. That takes some adjusting. If you've ever worked a night shift, you know what I'm talking about. Night shift work has a special culture and demands a special attention. In offices, you can see people in cubicles working in dark spaces with their little desk light on. The phones are mostly silent, just the sound of typing on keyboards. Or maybe the floor-scraping sounds of the mop bucket going by. You can sometimes hear music eking through the earbuds of one of your colleagues. Around any city, fewer people are awake in the night, except for maybe the police and ambulance who are cruising around waiting for those 911 calls. Or maybe bleary-eyed parents are awake, soothing crying babies. Intimate lovers are whispering sweet nothings. And Red Bull-saturated students cramming for exams. Night shift work has a special culture, demanding of your body with heightened senses for bumping into other night shift people as intimate strangers. You share that strange vulnerability of the night while you know nothing about them at all. So in our gospel today, we hear of one night shift worker, a Pharisee named Nicodemus. He came to Jesus by night. I imagine Nick just got off his part-time night shift work at the scroll-making factory. Nick had been stewing about this Jesus person that he encountered that day, and all Nick's friends were talking about this Jesus. His Facebook feed was filled with comments, his Twitter was aflutter, even his Instagram notifications were all about this Jesus. And Nick felt his breath rushing and his heart racing and his jaw clenching and his palms sweating and his eyes were burning. His heightened senses alerted him. And that night he knew he needed to see Jesus right then. Being a part-time religious leader, Nick had a theological reputation to uphold. And what a better time to have a one-to-one conversation like his community organizing training had taught him. So Nick practiced courage as he was taught and told Jesus what was on his mind without fear of anyone overhearing his conversation. "What's up, Jesus? You must be a divine teacher, because no one could do that God pointing and that God revealing you do apart from the presence of God." For Jesus, nighttime is a great time for a chat. After throwing the curveball about needing to be reborn, Jesus then explained, see, being born again is like that. It's not something you do. It's something the wind does. The Spirit does it. And this is what happens for God's sake. And Nick, being an external thinker, wondered aloud, how can this be? And we wonder too, maybe not out loud, but often at night, how can this be? Isn't it often at night that we too want to see Jesus? When we need Jesus? Isn't it nighttime when our senses are on alert, our questions deepen, and that yearning is tugging on our heart? Isn't it often at night that we worry about the coronavirus? We hear that a former colleague just entered hospice. We need Jesus. We lose a loved one. We gain a diagnosis. We need Jesus. Our best friend betrays us. We disappoint ourselves. We need Jesus. Isn't it often at night that we are exhausted as a queer person with the relentless coming out demanded by society? to new friends, new fellow students, casual conversations. And then we get angry at our own frustration and we feel let down by others. We need Jesus. Isn't it often at night that we are angered and disgusted, even as a white person, or maybe especially as a white person, at the systemic white supremacy that surrounds us on every side, of which we are a part, while vowing to dismantle? And while we're learning to listen more and not assume we know the best, God, we need Jesus. Isn't it often at night that we realize our society needs Jesus, plagued by what Pastor William Barber calls 5 interlocking injustices that are far too often not at the center of our nation's moral narrative? Far too often not at the center of our nation's moral narrative. Systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and distorted and misguided religious nationalism. The Reverend Dr. William Barber co-leads a movement, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Barber comes to Jesus in our country's dark night of the soul on behalf of people made poor by these interlocking injustices. He asks Jesus that the Son of Man be lifted up so that people made poor may have something to see and believe in and trust again. Jesus, Barber calls out, on our behalf, send the Spirit into God's people to work with and for the 140 million people, poor and low wealth people who live in the United States, people from every race and creed and sexuality and place. 140 million people. That's 40% of the United States, living in the nighttime of these 5 interlocking injustices. God, we need Jesus. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
See, working the night shift takes adjusting. If you've ever worked a night shift, you know what I'm talking about. Night shift work is a special culture that demands attention. So when Nick wondered aloud, how can this be? Jesus was right there. Jesus was present, and Jesus kept showing God's love. And Jesus explained how the Spirit works. He said, think of babies. They are born, and you see their flesh, and you can smell their hair and their outsides, and you got to change their diapers. Jesus continued, but the real person is born when the Spirit moves in them and they grow up and mature and become real people formed by the Spirit you cannot touch. Jesus continued his conversation with Nicodemus that night, saying, see, God loves the world, this whole cosmic creation, and every delicate snowflake and tear that falls. God loves with so much deep compassion, and God feels all that suffering, Nicodemus. God feels your angry vibrations, your racing heart, and your sweaty palms, and God is here. Then Jesus promised, God is so present in this world that in the daylight, Nicodemus, you will see people moving with a powerful Spirit in their eyes and their hands and their feet, and with a fire in their hearts. See, Jesus continued, God's got such a thing for this world, this loused up planet, that God sent me down here so that even if you don't believe with your own eyes, maybe you'll believe mine, Jesus said, or me, and you won't come sneaking around at night. God's got such a thing for this place. And then Nick knew he made the right decision to come to Jesus by night. Nick realized, indeed, this demands attention. So we wonder, how can this be? God in Jesus is present with us in our dark night of the soul. When we come to Jesus by night, even if we don't believe with our own eyes, maybe we will believe that Jesus sees the possibilities that can set the world right again. Even if we don't believe, Jesus believes in us. And there, with Jesus' night vision, we can glimpse the resurrection, a new way, a new hope for new life. But not yet. That's for Easter. God is not condemning the world, but saving the world, because God's love is that unexpected, that bold, and that abundant. God is making the world right through Jesus, who comes to us by night, filling us with a spirit of truth and compassion and a drive so that we can be Jesus' hands and feet and rushing breath and Jesus' racing heart to set the world right again. We might learn a new way to pass the peace. We find unexpected Jesus giving us resilience to explain again to someone what it means to be queer. We experience in new races, anti-racist allies, a productive anger to confront white privilege. We find a deep compassion in our heart, a deep Jesus-centered compassion for those who are hurting. See, we can set the world right again by practicing bravery in the night. We know how much we need Jesus, and that is where the Spirit gives birth to our lives. Take courage, friends. Night shift work is at hand, and this requires attention. God's attention is trained on you. With laser-focused love and forgiveness. Meet Jesus in the night and be born again by his radical grace. Now get out there with him and set the world right again. Amen.